Goddagens mina trevliga män och förtjusande kvinnor. Idag ska vi prata om Folke Bernadotte. Hello ladies and gentlemen and welcome back. Today we're going to talk about Folke Bernadotte. When we started this project, we thought it would just be an asterisk to the Stern video, a small adding of information, but we were very wrong. This will be the longest video I have ever made, because Folke Bernadotte is such an amazing character. And me being Swedish, I want to pay respect to my royal family. And this is one way I know I can do it. Folke Bernadotte was very close to the royal family, and in many ways still is very close to their heart. And in one way we can see this is that the future crown princess is actually named after Folke's wife, Estelle. The legacy of Folke will keep being here for generations to come. Folke Bernadotte is born the 2nd of January 1895 and died 17th of September 1948. His death is a very controversial one, and we will cover this last, so you get a bit of an understanding of who he is before we talk about this. His death till this day has made it so that the royal family hasn't visited Israel, so it's quite a controversial event. Now, quite an interesting thing to point out here that Folke Bernadotte actually doesn't really have the title of Bernadotte, which is the royal house. So in actuality, he has no right to the throne of Sweden. Now, why is this? Well, Folke Bernadotte actually has the title of Wisborg because of an event that happened to his father. You see, his father is Oscar Karl August Bernadotte. Born in November 1859, Folke's father, Prince Oscar Karl August, was the second son of the future King Oscar II and Queen Sofia of Sweden and Norway. Like his father, Prince Oscar was a dutiful servant and joined the navy at an early age. But his future took a left turn after he met the woman who will become Folke's mother, Ebba Munch, a dazzling young lady in waiting to the crown princess Victoria. Oscar's desire to marry Munch set off an immediate scandal. The Swedish constitution prohibits princes of royal houses from marrying non-royals, even if they are from a noble family. Oscar begged to be allowed to renounce his birthright, but his stubborn father wouldn't hear of it. Although the Munch family was definitely a respectable one, Ebba was a daughter of a well-regarded Colonel Carl Jacob Munch and Baroness Henrika Söderström. The king opposed what he considered a misalliance, but Oscar's mother was actually more sympathetic to Oscar's love interest. In a twist of fate, the queen suddenly fell quite ill, suffering from mysterious knife-like stabbing pains in her stomach that sidelined her for weeks. Her only chance for survival, according to the doctors, was a risky surgical procedure called ovariotomy. Agonizingly uncomfortable and at worst life-threatening. Before the operation, she summoned the king to her bedside, where she gave him the ultimatum: "If I undergo this operation and recover, you will allow Oscar and Ebba to do their way." The king adored his wife and would have done anything to reassure her. And of course, he caved in. So because of this marriage, it's why Folke Bernadotte does not have the right for the throne. Now, there's a lot of interesting people within of Wisborg's house. For example, Lennart Bernadotte, which became quite famous in Sweden of his own right.
Du stått på estraden, o Fritjof Andersson. Du har spelat på luta och gitarr. I extas du satt publiken med din sköna bariton. Knirra, knarra, dirra, darra, knirra, knarr.
Or, let's take his son, Göran Bernadotte, which is actually the black sheep in the Bernadotte family, and he passed away last month of September. Now, one can easily think because they created a new house that they were not close anymore to the royal family. That's actually not true. When the marriage actually happened, while the royal family did not really care for the marriage, the people showed their support and their sympathies. And Ebba Munch became a bit of a bridge between the commoners and the royals. So in that sense, they brought them closer to the royal family. And also, Folke and the rest of Bernadotte will be close to the royal family. So now that we understand that Folke is very close to the royal family, how was his upbringing? Well, Folke actually suffered from dyslexia, which made it so he wouldn't be easy for him in school, but he had some skills that would prove very valuable later in life. In 1904, in the age of 9, Folke traveled abroad for the first time, to England with his parents. The trip had a big impact on him. English became one of his best school subjects and his second tongue. Indeed, he had much more of a knack for foreign languages. He became fluent in French and in German as well. And this is what became important for him, because he couldn't really do much math or much writing because of his dyslexia. Another subject that he did really well was religion, which was stamped upon him through childhood. In 1909, he was confirmed in the Messiah Chapel in Stockholm at the age of 14. One event, possibly apocryphal, foreshadowed events to come. In Folke's 4th grade class, the teacher asked the pupils what they hoped to be when they grew up. One answered after the other, while young Folke sat back silently, apparently trying to formulate a proper response in his head, as if this was a very serious question he'd been asked. After careful deliberation, he replied, "I shall become a papa. Jag ska bli en pappa." At 18, Folke entered the Karlberg Military Academy. From there he trained as a dragoon and gained an enjoyment for horseback riding. He studied horsemanship at Storsholm Riding School. Riding horses would become one of his lifelong hobbies. Folke also had a few health complications as a child. Never the most robust of children, Folke suffered sporadic bouts of stomach pain throughout his youth. At first he dismissed these as minor annoyances, but they ballooned into a full-blown health crisis in 1916, when he was 21. Folke was in a grueling nighttime cavalry patrol when he suddenly slumped off his horse, unconscious, and tumbled to the ground. One of his comrades examined him by lantern light and was sickened to find his clothes moist, not in sweat, but in blood. Although he returned to normal within a few weeks, the episode will be the beginning of a lifelong and often incapacitating web of health issues surrounding stomach ulcers and the rectal bleeding often associated with it. Due to the complication, Folke would require massive ingestions of vitamin C, along with periodic stays at the hospital. These health complications stopped the pursuit of his military career, and the king during the time, which was his uncle, sent him to duties in France. And the argument for sending him to France is that because he couldn't join the military career, you can't have a member of the royal family moop around unsure on what to do. Folke decided he would pursue a career within diplomacy, which meant he has to learn French even more, and he has to take trips to Paris. The king was a bit worried, though, about the things that usually happens around Paris, so the king sent Folke's uncle, Prince Eugene, as his chaperone in France. It is quite fun to imagine that the king had to send down a chaperone just because Paris, Paris, the commune, the revolutionary Parisians. But the king wasn't actually an idiot either. A lot of this was also to look at Folke, because the king had a bit of an idea. The king actually planned to marry Folke to someone very special. The king invited the family to a banquet and carefully put Folke right next to her, just to spark something up. And now Folke found himself sitting next to a millionaire's only daughter, the tall, dark Estelle Manville, age 23. She exuded charm and grace, and Folke was so tongue-tied he could barely form a sentence. Rather than risk saying something stupid, he allowed all the natural stiffness of a typical Swede to hold sway. Even the normally charismatic Estelle, adapted to moving in high society circles, kept verbal communication to a minimum. I was not really at all griped by his personality, she would later admit. I wondered to myself whether he wasn't actually quite an ordinary and somewhat self-preoccupied gentleman. But the oddest of things happened. A balloon overhead suddenly burst, causing everybody to jump. It spun down and plumped right onto Folke's plate, which apparently broke the ice. Folke and Estelle couldn't help to laugh. Estelle later described Folke's laughter as special and completely irresistible. His face exploded in a bright and lusty laugh, and I suddenly realized that he had extraordinary blue eyes. I thought for a moment I could see the spirit of his soul, and in the same instant I realized he was a good man. Folke would go and propose to Estelle 2 weeks later. People noted this very sudden progression in the relationship, and they asked Folke about it, and he said, "You got to be the fast talker to get the best girl in the United States." Now, while all this was very cute and charming, the idea was they wanted him to marry someone of high standing, and the king actually mistook her. This is quite interesting. She if the king knew who she actually was, would have never married her away to Folke, because she's actually not of noble birth, or if any sort of noble birth. Her father became rich because of business. He was a poor man and became rich, so she doesn't have any noble ties. But they didn't actually know this. Kind of kept that on a low, because the Swedes actually believed that the Manville family was another Manville family, but they didn't know that, so the marriage went off and now everybody's happy. The marriage took place in the Episcopal Church of St. John in Pleasantville, New York. Folke's friend and cousin, Prince Gustav Adolf, was the best man. Right before the honeymoon, President Calvin Coolidge hosted the couple, as well as members of the Swedish royalty, for a White House luncheon. Folke and Estelle set up house in a 20-room villa called Dragon Garden, which is where the Chinese embassy stands now in Stockholm. Which is a fun little tidbit. Now the question is, did Folke become a papa? And the answer is yes, but there was a lot of complications. Folke had 4 children: Gustav Edvard Bernadotte, Folke Bernadotte, Fredrik Oskar Bernadotte, or Bertil Oskar Bernadotte. Now the thing is, with these 4 children, 2 of them died quite young. Fredrik Oskar passed away in 1934 of an enlarged thymus gland, and Gustav died of a blood infection at the age of 6 in 1936. Folke's first diplomatic mission was in 1933, in where he got a mission to represent the king in Chicago in the 1933 Century of Progress International Exposition, which is basically a world fair. And later in 1939 he would be appointed as Commissioner General for the Swedish exhibition at the 1939 New York World Fair. In the 1939 World Fair, it was quite dazzling and dramatic, but when Folke arrived, he was anything but impressed after discovering that. Much in his dismay, all things Sweden has been relegated to a very small hall, which was supposed to accommodate several nations. This did not fit well for Folke or any of the Swedes, who took great pride in their country's accomplishments, but he didn't waste any time voicing his complaints. But instead of shaking his fist, he protested quietly but sincerely. In the end, he got what he wanted: a space for a grand and entirely Swedish pavilion called Swedish Square that millions would rank as one of the fair's most outstanding venues. Folke and Estelle also took a vacation to the Glacier Park in Montana. He went to Blackfoot Indian Reservation. They would give him the name Emma Duyena, which means he who is idolized by everybody. Another diplomatic mission he had to do was in World War II, during the Finnish Winter Wars. The Battle of Finland changed Bernadotte's plan. Right before Estelle was set up to depart, he received a Western Union telegram from a group of leading Swedish citizens requiring him to stay in America so he could organize a volunteer corps of Swedish Americans to join in the Finnish struggle to repel the Soviet invaders. He was also called on to raise a fighting fund of $20 million from American finances to support the corps and to send material aid to the fierce but underfunded Finns. It was a desperate venture, riddled with political landmines and offering little chance of success, but Folke, being Folke, a man already ready to serve, he accepted the proposition. He called Swedish government officials to ensure that they were on board with the project, and they were. Due to American law forbidding foreign volunteers, Bernadotte had to find another way of aiding the Finns. He eventually found an ally in Lord Lehi, a British ambassador to America at the time. Lothian said if Folke could get pilots to Canada, he would grant them visas to travel to England so they can go on to Finland via Sweden. Folke managed to secure a number of planes and even reach out to Winston Churchill, who agreed to place a certain number of English planes at the Finns' disposals as long as Folke was able to amass the necessary pilots and ground crews. So here's another funny little tidbit for you Swedes out there. Folke worked together with Elsa Brändström. And if you don't know who Elsa Brändström is, she's called the Angel of Siberia. Elsa's father, Edvard Brändström, was the Swedish ambassador to Russia during the time and was in the court of Tsar Nicholas II. But in 1908, she actually was in St. Petersburg, and she was in St. Petersburg when World War I happened, where she volunteered a position to become a nurse for the Imperial Russian Army. In 1915, she went up to Siberia as part of the Swedish Red Cross to introduce basic medical treatment for German and Austrian POWs. Up to 80% of the POWs died of cold, hunger, and disease, As Elsa Brändström visited the first camp and witnessed the inhumane situation, she decided to dedicate her life to these soldiers. The men were from Germany and Austria. Many of them had typhoid fever, and when these German men were lying down, dying of typhoid, they looked up to this tall, blue-eyed, blonde-haired nurse. And because of that, she became an angel. She was an angel to these people. So, therefore the nickname, the Angel of Siberia. She went back to St. Petersburg, established a Swedish aid organization, but it didn't really work out because, the Russian Revolution happened. Yeah. So the Russians actually didn't allow her to have a work permit, but she didn't really give up. She went back and forth to Siberia. She was arrested in Omsk and even condemned to death for being a spy. But it was revoked. Then after that, she returned to Sweden and organized fundraisers with her family, treated POWs, and then she immigrated to Germany. Later in the 20s, she went to America doing the same thing, sort of fundraising, talking about medical things and trying to get money up. And here, during the 30s, she actually helped Folke to collect money for the Finnish. So she was part of that, moving around and trying to get money. She was quite good at that. There's a lot more to her, but that's the basics. But she's quite a figure. And that she was with Folke and helped Folke out with the Finns is really showing the power the Swedes has, the neutral power. But the funny story about the Finland war, actually, if you didn't know this, it is one of the, throughout the Swedish history, there's never been a moment where Swedes were that active. Swedes are very passive creatures. But during the Finnish wars, when that happened, I think they said up to 80% or so of the Swedish population rallied. Never rallied before. They rallied and they collected money, they took in orphans, they sent chocolates, they sent everything you can imagine. Everybody sent everything they could because it felt like their brother was under attack, so they had to help them. Yeah, it's kind of funny. We don't actually see Denmark or Norway as our brother, we see Finland as our brother. So, and if I'm correct with the numbers, about 1 million people fled to Sweden during that war, so it was quite intense. And now with this information, we can easily understand that Folke Bernadotte was an agent for Mannerheim. But the public campaign that these two had together wasn't actually without issues. They actually stopped painting him as quite bad, and one of the things they painted him as, that he was an agent, a Swedish agent from Mannerheim. For some reason, Mannerheim equals bad, and working to help Finnish people makes you an agent for Mannerheim? What? We found out that this type of information was actually a psyop by the Soviets. The Soviets trying to push anti-Folke, anti-Finnish propaganda in America to avoid people helping them out. Investigating where the story originated from, Folke discovered that some of the men who had visited him under the pretense of enlisting as volunteer pilots were actually communist spies trying to glean details about his plan. Folke by 1942 became the head of the Swedish Red Cross because the former needed a replacement. He couldn't really be staying there, Prince Carl. The search for a successor was on. By the later part of 1942, serious discussions were underway as how to fill the void. The highly respected Red Cross worker, Lieutenant General Axel Hultkrantz, suggested to Sigfrid Enström, the director of the huge ISEA electric concern, chairman of the International Olympic Committee, and one of the most prominent figures in Sweden, that Folke took over. Edström agreed with the choice. No better man than Folke Bernadotte can find a Red Cross find, he said. I saw how he managed Swedish effort in New York World Fair, but I fear we shall never get him. He is such a sought-after man. One of the first breakthrough moments of fame for Folke's humanitarianism was heading a large POW exchange between the Allies and Germans in 1943. When the Nazis hovered, the scene was finally set in the fall of 1943 for an exchange of POWs. After 2 years of tense negotiation, a play-by-play arrangement had been worked out. This time the exchange would happen in the Swedish port city of Göteborg, as well as through Smyrna, Turkey, and Oran, Algeria. With the Swedish Red Cross handling most of the technicalities, Folke had finally the chance to test his old-fashioned military moxic on a grand scale. This is a quote from Folke about the turn of events. "I do not know how many times my assistants and I drafted detailed plans for the transport and exchange program, plans that could have been carried out the following day for various reasons. It happened at the last minute. A few ships were torpedoed or bombed, so we had to start all over again. We did this with enthusiasm. For my own part, I can say that until then, I have never had a mission which interested me more. The conscientiousness of being a cog in a machine, which would enable thousands of soldiers of various nationalities to be sent back to their homeland after many years of imprisonment, filled us with great happiness and encouraged us to do our utmost to make everything run smoothly. About 10,000 wounded or sick POWs would be exchanged with Britain and Germany through this event." In the CBS interview a day after the exchange, Folke said, "These rather strenuous days have been some of the most happy days of my life. From all sides, American, British and Germans, I have received many times words of appreciation and thanks, and that of course makes me very happy. I think back on the results of those days. I know that I am the one who ought to be thankful for having the privilege to lead this operation and see how lights of happiness have come in my eyes of all these American, British and German repatriables. Their happiness has been the best reward of my life." By November of 1943, Folke was in Switzerland cooperating with the Red Cross in order to plan a possible POW exchange with the Soviets and the Germans. The Swiss gave Folke the green light to head to Berlin, and by the 22nd of November he was in Berlin. Due to the complex relationship with the German Red Cross, and the fact that the Soviets were never signers of the Geneva Convention, it didn't really go anywhere. Folke had a dinner meeting with the Swedish legation, and the attic had caught fire from the air raid. The bombing of Berlin there had stayed in his mind for the rest of his life. Total war had this night shown itself at its worst. He later wrote, "It nurtured bitter thoughts. So this is where civilization had led us. Here was a drama which bested the life of a modern man. The curtain had not only risen in Berlin, but also in London and Warsaw, Rotterdam and elsewhere. The whole thing was a nightmare." In 1945, Folke got a very special assignment, and in a way it became something that would define who he is in Swedish history. In February of 1945, it was said that they were going to have buses sent down to Germany to save people from concentration camps. They got this idea because in 1944 there was another type of exposition where people got saved from concentration camps because of a few buses. So the Swedish Red Cross thought, maybe we can do this again, but a proper organization, a proper structure and more people and resources to try to save as many people as they can. Now it was quite a successful operation, saving up to 15,000. It had different times and periods to when people were saved, who was saved and things like that. I'll go into a little bit of detail when I explain to you how this all came to be. Folke had to do this quite uniquely. Before I go into how Folke actually did this, let's talk about the timeline. And there is quite a lot of criticism on how this was handled. But trust me, it makes sense after some time. In the 12th of March was when the buses went down through Germany. And pardon me if I do misspell some of these German names here. The first bus went to Sachsenhausen concentration camp, to Neuengamme concentration camp, bringing 2,200 Norwegians and Danes. Now the thing is with this, and here is actually one of the bigger criticism, when the first buses came around, a lot of people criticized them, saying like, well, my conditions are not going to be better. You're saving me from one concentration camp to another concentration camp. Excuse me. And the thing is, with a lot of these Danes and Norwegians, they were not feeling very well. If I may add a joke here. Alright. There's no people around, I can make the joke. But, let me go back a bit. This bus, a lot of Danes with diarrhea on it. Sorry, I had to make a joke. I had to make that joke. And this is true. The thing is, with the first buses in particular, a lot of the Danes, in particular the Danes, had sicknesses in the stomach and they're having diarrhea. So during the first ride, they had to take a lot of pauses because the Danes were just crapping all over the bus. It's just liquid shit. And when he was sent to the concentration camp, they didn't get it much better. But there were a reason why they were sent to a different concentration camp. It was to get closer to the Danish border, so that later on could send them back to Denmark. But they had to put them there at first because that was the arrangement. The 19th of March, transportation went to southern Germany, bringing 559 to Nuremberg. 26th of March, the first transport of Swedish German married women was sent back to Sweden. In 26th of March, transport of French, Belgian, Norwegian, Polish, and Russians was sent to Nuremberg. On the 29th of March, the Swedish Red Cross was now allowed to access Nuremberg, where they were sending the prisoners. The 30th of March, transportation around the area of Leipzig was allowed to send around 1,200 people directly to Denmark, and of these were 1,000 Danish policemen. On the 2nd of April, a new convoy was coming into Germany, and this time they were picking up the prisoners in Nuremberg to bring back. On the 5th of April, half of the team was replaced by Danish. On the 8th of April, the first transportation from Ravensbrück brought 100 female prisoners who were sent to Denmark. On the 9th of April, they started picking up more people from Nuremberg, a lot of these being Danish and a lot of them being sick. And also at the same time, they were sending trucks to Berlin to pick up people there as well. On the 15th of April, 524 prisoners, these people were not in concentration camps, just in the prisons, were picked up from Mecklenburg, and 423 Jews were picked up from Theresienstadt. On the 18th of April, the first attack on the white buses has occurred, and 4 Danish drivers and 1 nurse got light injuries. On the 20th of April, evacuation of all Scandinavian prisoners in Nuremberg had happened, and they were sent to Sweden via Denmark. On the 23rd of April, transportation of the sick prisoners in Ravensbrück, 783 and 360 women of 2 colons to Paderborn. On the 25th of April, a convoy of 934 women and 1 train, 3,989 women, which was the last transportation away from Ravensbrück. On the 13th of April, a ship called the Magdalena had 223 prisoners, and Little Mathiasen had 225 women that went from Lübeck. On the 2nd of May, 2,000 women, 960 of these being Jews, 790 being Polacks, and 250 being French, has been now sent to Denmark. On the 3rd of May, a German ship with prisoners from Nuremberg was attacked by the RAF. Everybody on board, 7,500 people, died. On the 4th of May, the last prisoners were sent by boat from Copenhagen to Malmö. According to the Swedish Red Cross, the numbers were 15,345 prisoners. Of these were 7,795 Scandinavians and 7,550 being of another country. That was the journey that the white buses took, and if you only view it from the journeys itself, it does look a bit shady, and I get it if you look at it that way. Yes, that early on they had to put them from one concentration camp to another concentration camp, all of the sicknesses. A lot of the Danes who were sent to the second concentration camp thought they would die because they were so sick. They were having diarrhea, and a lot of them had other types of sicknesses as well. So many of them thought they would die, and I don't blame them. This was questionable situations. But the other part of the story, they explain why they had to do it early on and why it sort of accelerated and they could save a lot more people later on, is through Folke's work. Now, what is very important to remember about this had to be done with an agreement of the German government, because if it wasn't the case of that, then they would be shot down or put as treasons, and that's not great. So they had to go to the Germans, to the Nazis, and have an agreement with them to be able to save as many people as possible. And here is quite an interesting story of what Folke had to do, and it sort of shows why Folke is a masterclass of a diplomat. Like, wow. Folke went down to Berlin to have some conversation with different types of Nazi officials, such as Ribbentrop. He quite reasonably described his situation and why he wanted to do what he wanted, and he never hid the fact that he wanted to save people. And because of that, the head of the SS during the time, which is Heinrich Himmler, wanted to meet him. And he met face to face with Himmler. Folke's first impression of Himmler was this. Himmler was a modest little man who looked like a harmless schoolteacher from the country, whom one would hardly have noticed if one met him on the street. He had small, delicate and sensitive hands, which I noticed were well manicured, although manicure was forbidden in the SS. He seemed strictly and amazingly obligent. He displayed traits of humor with a hint of grimness, which he used to reveal the tension. Least of all, there was anything diabolical in his appearance. Of the cold hardness in his face, of which I've heard so much, I saw none. In his talk with me, he showed himself to be a very lively individual, quite sentimental in his enthusiasm as well. It was a highly remarkable experience to listen to the man who had employed the most scandalous means to send millions of people to death, talking with rapture about the gentlemanly methods of warfare between the Germans and the British in French in the summer of 1944, when action was interrupted in the middle so both sides could collect their wounded. It was also remarkable to feel his reaction when, towards the end of our discussion, I gave him a 16th century work of Swedish runestone by a Norwegian who worked amongst the prisoners of war in Germany. I had got a tip that Himmler was especially interested in Norwegian runestones. He was so vividly moved. Anyways, he said the friendliness I showed him in this way had made a deep impression on him, and that he was grateful I had in this manner elected to give him the pleasure under these present circumstances. Himmler was one of the most complicated people I have ever met. By the end of the discussion, the agreement was made between the two. Norwegian and Danish prisoners were to put in one camp so they could be put under the care of the Swedish Red Cross, selecting the sick, the elderly and the widowed Swedish women who were married to Germans to be shipped to Sweden. Here's another little fun tidbit. Quite early in the conversation, Himmler had examined Folke's badges, remarking that, "I am surprised you're only a major." Folke retorted, "I don't think it's any more surprising the fact that you are a commander-in-chief." But this relationship with Himmler is what got the people to be able to be saved from the concentration camps. If not for this good relationship, there would be no way that the Germans would have buckled for his demands. Another actually interesting thing here is that Himmler had stomach aches, pretty much just like Folke. And Himmler's doctor was a person who was very involved in trying to save Scandinavian prisoners, and he'd done it before. So he actually talked to Folke quite a lot to more and more over time be able to help more people. Because of Himmler liking Folke and Himmler's doctor liking Folke, they were able to save quite a lot of people, as we talked about before. But this is why it was also this progression. In the early stages, Himmler allowed only few things, which is what they agreed upon. Folke used more of his charm and likability to be able to save more people. To be able to save the Czech people, for example, was nothing that was agreed upon, and it was quite controversial, but they had their little excuses, which was, well, we can't check their nationality because they have no passports or visas, so just let them in the buses, which they agreed upon. And then when it came to saving the Jews, Himmler did allow a few in early on, which is absolutely nuts for him to agree upon. But then when the few came in, they started taking more and more and more and more. And the SS and the Gestapo during the time tried to stop them, saying, hey, whoa, this was not agreed upon. These people are going to, no, they can't be saved. The Folke's people just bribed the SS and the Gestapo to allow more and more people in of Jewish descent. And they were allowed to. So this is why there was quite a lot of Jews saved during the White Buses as well, because of Folke's ability to charm Himmler and to trick the SS and the Gestapo to save more Jews. Because Folke did a good job in his quite good diplomatic skills, he became a UN diplomat in the Israel-Palestine area. And here is where things goes quite So if you don't remember, in 1948, Folke was assassinated in Jerusalem. Now we're gonna spend our time talking about this. Sort of what happened, what brought up to it, what groups and what ideologies were involved in the assassination of Folke. And there's quite a lot there, and we're gonna add our own little tidbits to this as well. But I think we'll start with talking about the Lehi. So there's a video I already made about Avraham Stern, and I recommend you watching that before you watch this part, because this part is sort of an add-on to the Avraham Stern video. So certain things, so I won't go into detail about things I've already talked about in the Avraham Stern video. I'll talk about post-Stern. So if there are certain things that doesn't add up, it's because it's already added in the Avraham Stern video. Now we're going to go in and talk about the post-Avraham Stern Lehi. They're quite different from when Abraham was there, and a lot has happened. We will start by talking about a man named Yitzhak Yezernitsky, later to be known as Yitzhak Shamir. He had quite a familiar origin to Stern, living in a secluded village in Poland. Yitzhak was a member of a Zionist revisionist youth group, the Betar, which would entrench Shamir in the organization's ideology. Shamir's father was quite critical of the revisionist movement's demands for mass migration to the Holy Land, but by 1935, a decade after Stern's migration to the Mandate, did Yitzhak make his own trek. Yitzhak was much like other members to be known as part of the Lehi, former members of the Argun, infatuated and captivated by Avraham Stern's romantic vision. Yitzhak, along with his colleague Nathan Gillen Moore, would become part of the upper command for Stern's terror group. Yitzhak would take the underground name of Michael, after the Irish resistance leader Michael Collins. By 1942, majority of Jews in Palestinian jails were related one way or another to the Lehi. Yitzhak was one of those who received Stern's final letter. The underground needed to continue, and by September the 1st, he made a successful prison escape. Armed with Yahir's, which is Avraham Stern's, posthumous blessing, Shamir, the quiet man, recognized as the group's best organizer, had no trouble imposing control over the new underground. We start anew. He announced in his flat voice to the small group assembled in the Orange Grove. He reorganized the Lehi. As it would henceforth be known, it would become a nearly airtight conspiracy. No one was to know anyone else's real name, only his or her code name. Operations, all of them planned by Shamir, were to be carried out by cells of 3 or 4. The dead Avraham Stern was still the impression and guiding spirit, but the hard-nosed new leader jettisoned Avraham Stern's more extravagant schemes. For one thing, Michael abandoned dreams of link to the Axis, a notion even more bizarre in 1943 than has been 2 years earlier. The other 2 or 3 who made up the newer upper trio of the Lehi was previously mentioned Nathan Moore and Yisrael Eldad. Joining the two as the head of the new revived underground was a 32-year-old Polish-born Bible teacher named Israel Eldad. They formed a triumvirate called the Center. Moore, a civil engineer and a mathematician who once edited a revisionist newspaper in Warsaw, was in charge of the political activities and represented the Lehi in negotiation with the Argun and the Haganah. With his thin wisp of a voice and tall, shapeless body, he looked more like a coffee pot than a ruthless gorilla. Eldad, known as the Doctor, was a brilliant, electric personality, enthralled by the fierce power of his own voice and its biblical message. He handled ideological indoctrination and wrote propaganda the way Mozart composed music. In the words of his former colleague Barak Nadel, "If you take Eldad and put him on the pedestal, he will talk for 10 hours without trouble. He is what we need in Israel. He is what we in Israel call an astronaut. He knows nothing about what is happening on Earth." 2 intellectuals and 1 organizer, that would be the triumvirate. By 1944, the numbers of the underground had swelled, and one operation had put the underground back to the map of terror-sweeping Zion. The triumvirate had set, agreeing upon putting to death His Majesty's Minister of State for the Middle East, Walter Edward Guinness, aka Lord Minoy. The assassination would be executed by a small cell led by one Joshua Cohen. who would go in 47 to conduct a similar attack on Folke Bernadotte. Motivated by the minister's refusal to negotiate the migration of the Hungarian Jews into the region, they still have shot Lord Mahon in his car. Though the Lehi had been denounced yet again by both the colonial government and their fellow Zionists for this action, the whole air of the region would shift gears in 1945. On July 26, 1945, Lehi received support from an unexpected source, London. With the election of the British Labour government, many mainstream Zionists expected the end of the reviled White Paper and the opening, at long last, of Palestine's opening door to European Jews who survived the war. Almost immediately, Clement Attile, expressing the hope that the British government may find it possible without delay to take steps to lift the restriction of the White Papers on Jewish immigration to Palestine. Truman was not a wild hope, and the Labour Party had been staunchly opposed to the White Paper policy from its birth. In a reply dated September 16, making Attile's policy on Jewish immigration official, the Labour Prime Minister answered with a line worthy of his Conservative predecessors. Allowing more Jews into Palestine would set the Middle East ablaze. To avert that dire situation, the Labour government should permit a tickle of 1,500 Jews a month to enter Palestine. The Haganah, staunch opponent to the competitors of the Irgun and Lehi, had now felt an alliance between the organization. For all of Stern's preaching for a joint Zionist struggle against the Anglos' presence in Israel, it only took 3 years after his death for this to be realized. Something to also point out that the terror attacks in 1945 was rampant, and the UN's resolution on November 29, 1947 had created a Jewish and an Arab state within Palestine. The Arab, forming an alliance of the Arab Legion, retaliated by invading the nation after subjugated violence erupted in the Levant. And in this, Bernadotte comes into the picture. So we thought the UN had an idea of a two-state solution, one for the Arabs and one for the Jews. Now, exactly how this was going to happen was very complicated. That's what Folke's job was, to sort of find a middle way for both groups to work. And Bernadotte made two plans in particular, but the second Bernadotte plan is the one that's most famous. You can see it right here in front of you. The northern orange part is where the Jews should get, the southern middle pink part is where the Arabs should get, and Jerusalem and Bethlehem should be a UN-controlled area, sort of like international zone. Now the thing is, this wasn't actually viewed as that bad, within quotation marks. There were people who liked it, because this is majority Arab as majority Jew places getting their slice of the cake. And there is a lot of controversy around this map in particular, and around the assassination of Folke, which in some ways has to do with this. This is the main point of view, that he was killed because of this plan, but in actuality it's a lot more complicated than that, and we will talk about it. But before we do that, I just want to go into detail and tell you how Folke was killed. On September the 17th, 1948, at 10:15, one of these perfectly polished mornings the region offered up in early fall, Count Folke Bernadotte's white DC-3 began its descent into the State of Israel. The United Nations aircraft landed smoothly on the tiny airship at Kaladia, north of Jerusalem. Folke Bernadotte, the first United Nations mediator between Arab and Jews. Following on May 27, 1948, Security Council resolution ordering a truce between Israel and the Arabs, Bernadotte had conjoined both sides into agreeing to lay down their weapons. General Lash finished with his tirade, now urged Bernadotte to take an armed Arab Legion escort to his next stop, Jerusalem. But the Count shook his head. 80 UN observers in Jerusalem have no such protection, he said. Why should I? Nevertheless, as Bernadotte chatted with other members of the group, General A.G. Lundström, a tall, rangy fellow Swede, who was the UN Chief of Staff in the region, took Lash aside and said, "Yes, we should gratefully accept an armored car to escort Bernadotte's convoy to the Maidelbaum Gate, which divided the Arab and the Jewish zones in Jerusalem." Hearing that Lundström had done, Bernadotte shrugged and smiled resignedly. Less than an hour later, his convoy reached the holy city without further incident. "Good luck to you," an American reporter called to Bernadotte as his car rolled across the line separating the Arab and the Jewish zones. "Thanks," the mitigator waved back, flashing one of his wide smiles. "I shall need it." When the convoy stopped on the Jewish side, a burly man saluted the mitigator and introduced himself. "Captain Moshe Hillman, Israeli Army liaison." Noticing Hillman's service rifle tucked into his holster, Bernadotte said, "I'm afraid you have to leave that behind, Captain. None of our men are armed." Bernadotte pointed to the bullet hole in his car's fender. "What's the use of one revolver against that? The UN flag is our only protection." Neither side had paid much attention any longer to the truce the mitigator had pieced together. Twice he had succeeded. Initially in June, and then when the first 4-week truce expired and combatants resumed the deadly business. Again in mid-July. In the background, the random pop-up of a sniper rifle and the dull thud of an Arab mortars punctuated the group's conversation. Bernadotte had seen the Jewish paper that morning. He was stung by the transcript of the Israeli Foreign Minister Moshe Chertok's news conference. Chertok charged the count with turning a blind eye to the Arab truce violation, while overreacting to Israel's minor infractions. This seemed astonishingly undiplomatic message from the foreign minister, whom Bernadotte had recently called his friend. The count was unaccustomed to such blunt treatment. Before leaving Stockholm for the Middle East, just 2 weeks earlier, Bernadotte asked his wife, Estelle, about the danger. He had even left her precise instructions for his funeral. He refused, however, an offer from the Swedish police to fit him with a flak jacket. He found it too cumbersome, he said, for his high-energy style. Almost no one agreed with the Swedish choice of residence. He toured the hill of the evil Cancel. Bernadotte finally realized his eddies were right, and he abandoned his dream of living there. But the Israeli newspapers already carried stories about the mediator's interest in the residence, and it's a place where the history and symbolism matter enormously. Another message, it was not the first, had linked Bernadotte with the despised British. Now this will be very important, but we'll come into this part in particular. Like, this part right here, what I just said to you, is one big reason. But we'll continue. Colonel Andrei Surratt pulled Hillman aside. "When we get back into the cars, would you change place with me, Captain?" the French officer asked. "I need a few minutes privately with the mitigator." Hillman has been sitting between Count Bernadotte and General Lundström in the convoy. Surratt explained to the puzzled Hillman that my wife spent the war in Dachau. She owns her survival to Bernadotte. I want to thank him. In the first car, Lundström's Dassault, Major Masrat sat behind the wheel, with Barbro Wessel squeezed between him and Captain Hillman. John de Geur and Lundström aided the camp. John Fletch sat in the back. De Geur and Barbro had made a secret pact. Alarmed at the hostilities Bernadotte aroused whenever he was in Israel, the two young Swedes agreed to form a human shield between the Count and potential danger by occupying the first car of every convoy in which he traveled. The Swiss Dr. Vassell followed the De Soto in his own car, the mediator's car. A shiny new Chrysler was last. Colonel Frank Begley drove, with U.S. Marine Commander Cox next to him, and Count sat in the back on the right-hand side. As the convoy began to climb the steep, narrow path of Polmak Street, which lead to the affluent Tilbaya section, the familiar sight of another army roadblock forced them to slow down. An Israeli soldier dropped a barricade across the road as they approached. Captain Hillman shouted, "Shalom, Havrim! It's okay, it's the UN mitigator!" And the soldiers lifted the barricade with a wave of his hand for them to pass. The road looked innocent. Open fields lay on either side, punctuated by a few scattered 3 or 4-story apartment houses of pale Jerusalem stone. 2 children pushed bicycle up a steep hill. Slowly, the convoy passenger began to lose some of their attention. A small store where 30 children bought drinks after school came into view, and from behind it emerged a large Israeli jeep, resembling, except for the fact it was looking new, every other jeep in the city. 4 soldiers, their caps pulled low to their faces, appeared to be drowsing inside. As the convoy slowly rose over the hill, the jeep and its passengers stirred. It nosed into a narrow rose, forcing Bernadotte's convoy to go to full stop. 3 men in the Kati shorts and Wisner military hats of the Israeli army sprang, with military precision, from the jeep, while a 4th man kept one eye on the steering wheel and the other on his revolver. Fingers on the trigger, and their submachine guns, 2 men approached the left side of the convoy. Inside the DeSoto, the 3 young Swedes and the Belgian major groped their papers. "It's okay, boys," Hellman's jaunted voice boomed out. "Let us pass. It's the UN medicator." Ignoring the Israeli officer, the gunmen sprayed the DeSoto's tires, irradiating with gunfire. Then they moved rapidly on the next car, which belonged to the Red Cross doctor. Meanwhile, the 3rd man raced towards the Chrysler, and the thrust of the barrel of Schmisser into the open window of the back seat. Folke Bernadotte saw the glint of metal. His companion heard him utter something, like an exclamation, as a blast blew back against the seat, toppling forwards. Blood spattered across his face and soaked his shirt. 6 bullets tore into his left arm, his throat, and his chest. The assassin kept firing, pumping 18 bullets into the French officer who wanted to thank Bernadotte for saving his wife from Dachau. And with that, only a few minutes later, Folke Bernadotte was dead. On October 19, 1948, the Security Council noted with concern that Israel have submitted no report that the body regarding its investigation into the assassination. It was not until 8 months later, on May 3, 1949, that Israel finally submitted its account. It revealed that the majority of the Stern gang members rounded up in the purge has been released within 2 weeks. These not released were held until a general amnesty was granted on February 14, 1949. In granting the amnesty, the Israeli Special Military Court stated that it was unable to establish with any degree of certainty that the murder of Count Bernadotte was carried out by the order of the Lehi. The assassins of Folke Bernadotte was never put on trial in Israel, and in Washington, the State Department never revealed the results of the investigation. It was the primary scale, precision, and speed of evacuation escape that made the department suspicious that the Stern gang was not involved alone, and the details of the escape were a major part of the department's investigation, but the Czech connection was also worrying. And in the 2 or 3 months after the killing, the US Air Attachment in Prague investigated the Air Force manifest for flights between Israel and Prague, both before and after the attack. This led to the suggestion that it was an operation that might have been planned and prepared in Czechoslovakia, and a specific trained squad has been flown into Israel from Prague for that purpose. Alright, so now I laid it down all on the table. Let's talk about reasoning behind it. So, there are 2 main factions right now, and there's multiple discussion groups on what exactly was at fault. And we have our own theory, and sort of proof for that theory as well, which was laid down here. We looked into all of the combined documents, and we'll describe it here as best as we can. So usually one of the main reasons is the second Bernadotte plan, which we talked about before, but as it's been pointed out before, that was actually just released a few days before his death. It wasn't really something that the media could have talked about, and the anti-Bernadotte propaganda has actually been going on for quite a while. There is a recent interview with one of the young boys who seen Bernadotte being killed, and he described Bernadotte as pro-Arab and anti-Semite and even a Nazi, sort of assistant Hitler, which describes the mindset of the people during the time. That mindset had to be fabricated somehow, and we saw that because Folke's friends, that was also part of the Israeli newspapers, has started writing bad things about Folke, which excuses his death in sort of way after the fact, because you had to put the mindset of the Jewish people in Israel that it's okay to kill the UN medicator, and you do that through propaganda, and that's what happened. That's why Folke also had a bit of a iffy concern about his friend betraying him for the sake of propaganda. Alright, so we understand that, but yeah, the main reasoning is usually the plan, that the Stern gang didn't like the plan. You know, that's wrong. It's a main concern, but that's actually somewhat wrong. Well, not fully wrong. The plans he made him look pro-Arab, and just a little bit of concern of them. But overall, it was not their main concerns. Their main concerns, and this is the second theory that people actually have, that he was moving his office to Jerusalem. Now, he stated that he's actually not doing this, but at that point, there was already rumored, and Lehi's anti-Anglo stance and like anti-Arab stance, and that made him look like a British puppet. Putting him in Jerusalem would also make Jerusalem the international zone for the UN that they had planned in the second Bernadotte plan, and it would give more power to the Arabs according to the Lehi. So yes, for the Lehi itself, the idea was do not allow Jerusalem to become a sort of pro-Arab UN British puppet city of sorts. That was their excuse. But as I just pointed out, there are multiple people. The Lehi was not alone. And the second main group that was part of this was actually the Israeli government, and that being David Ben-Gurion. Actually, it's been proven at this point that Ben-Gurion actually had a large part in the killing of Folke Bernadotte. But the reason for that was actually different from the Lehi. Ben-Gurion had two reasons for killing Bernadotte. A big reason was the Negev desert. Ben-Gurion really wanted that desert because it would give him the port city of Eilat, which would make him not having to use the Suez Canal. It would give Israel, or future Israel, more economic opportunities and not making them rely on the Suez, which is an international zone, but at the same time, the more independence, the better. So he didn't like the plan for that reason. But the thing is, he wouldn't have accepted killing Bernadotte just for that reason. So why was that? Another interesting tidbit before I go into the second reason. He actually didn't mind Jerusalem being an international UN-controlled area. Not at all. Not his biggest concern. His biggest concern was the desert. But the second reason why he sort of agreed upon this and gave Lehi the ability to do this was because he wanted the Lehi gone. At this point, the three main groups had an internal fight with each other. And they wanted the Lehi gone because Lehi, they created quite a lot of terror during this time. So they thought, okay, we can frame the Lehi on killing the UN mediator, not by botching it up, because if we botch it up, a lot of people are going to talk, but it's still going to help them out. But people are going to look at the Lehi before they look at us or look at anyone else. So it's a perfect opportunity to frame the Lehi for being radical, murdering, terrorist revolutionaries, this backfired. Backfired big times on Ben-Gurion. Multiple Lehi members became prime ministers after the fact. So yeah, that backfired big time. But that was one of his mindsets as well. Just to point out, the last theory that we have is a bit unusual, but it just seems more fitting based upon the history that they have together with the Lehi. They've done this before, where they've given the Lehi all the crap for things they have done together, because this era of Israeli history is very dark. It's not pretty. But I'm actually going to end this not so much with Bernadotte, because Bernadotte's story has now ended. But I'm going to end this with sort of a message to Israel, I should say. Because on the 13th of October, the Prime Minister of Israel is coming to Sweden to talk about anti-Semitism, and in particular also Folke Bernadotte. He's probably going to see the white buses. And I don't think he will ever apologize to the royal family for this. Because of this murder, the Bernadotte family has actually never visited Israel, and they probably won't until someone has said, I'm sorry for what happened. And that's what I'm hoping could happen in the end of the day. We'll see. I do want to take into consideration the book of Joshua here a bit. In the book of Joshua, it talks about the Battle of Jericho. In the Battle of Jericho, they slaughtered every single person inside of Jericho after God tore down the walls after 7 days. It was very brutal what the Jews did for the people that had the Levant during the time. They were slaughtering every single one of them. 2 men from Gibeon tricked their way in and said they were from another tribe and they wanted peace with the Jews. And they agreed upon it, until just a few days later they found out that these people were from Gibeon, a place they were planning to conquer. But because they made an agreement with God, they actually spared the people of Gibeon, even though they were planning to kill them. Many years after the fact, they wanted to apologize, and they asked the people from Gibeon to forgive them for the terror they have created in Canaan. After the Gibeons gave the Jews a very harsh task for the forgiveness, they forgave them. And this is the mindset I do want to give to the current state of Israel. You are established. Ask for forgiveness for the things you've done in Canaan. Yes, the demands might be harsh, but they will forgive. And this is what I wish they will do to Folke Bernadotte, that they will talk to the current royal family and ask for forgiveness. Yes, I understand that you might argue, it wasn't us, it was them. No. Just ask for forgiveness. A harsh demand might be given, but forgiveness will be given, and wounds can be healed.